thank you. So for all of those who don't know, I have a vocal cord paralysis. So, but inshallah, with the help of this mic, you will be able to understand what I'm saying. But before I start my paper, actual paper or talk, I want to say a few words about comparative theology, Islamic political theology, Islamic comparative theology, because you know we already discussed yesterday these terms and what is meant by this and so on and so on. So only briefly, what is comparative theology? So comparative theology is a newer form of theology of religions. So while the traditional theology of religions is done from a macro-structural perspective, so scholars of theology of religions ask themselves, when they compare different religious traditions and their truth claims, how are these truth claims related to their own religious truth claims? And this results in the questions of inclusivism, exclusivism, and so on. So comparative theology is differentiated from this type of theology of religions through the fact that it's microstructural. So it's related not to these general truth claims, but it engages with concrete religious propositions and religious practice. And it is decisively a hermeneutical endeavor. So, and with the aim to learn from each other. So I give you an example, Rahman Mustafa's paper or talk from yesterday. This could be done in a comparative theological way if Rahman would be a Sufi, and as a Sufi would say, I have certain ritual practice which I'm engaging, and now I will talk with a techno raver, come into conversation with him with regard to certain ritual practices. And this leads to a mutual learning process of understanding. So what were these techno ravers yesterday doing when he was reciting also Quran, or using Quranic recitation and so on and so on. And what are you experiencing as a Sufi and so on and so on. Another example from the perspective of propositions would be that when I'm engaging with a Christian colleague on the question, what does it mean that God is the Son of God, Christ is the Son of God? And I try to understand his position, this proposition, and I explain why I don't believe this is the case. This is basically comparative theology when this leads to a mutual understanding. So yeah, so this is only a brief explanation what comparative theology means. So what is then Islamic comparative theology? Because at first glance this seems to be a contradictio in adjecto, because how can it be comparative and Islamic? So because a conference 2 years ago with Idris, we claimed we are defining Islamic comparative theology. So what do we mean by this? Firstly, we want to make transparent that the traditional comparative theology is in fact a Christian comparative theology. It is done mainly by Christian theologians. They justify their own methodology with reference to Christological Christian concepts. So this is not what we are planning to do. So when we speak about Islamic comparative theology, we don't only mean that now comparative theology is done by Muslims. So otherwise we could say Muslim comparative theology. But we also claim Islamic comparative theology is comparative theology justifies and with reference to the normative Islamic traditions, Quran, Hadith, and Sunnah. So we also try to justify normatively why we think it's good to do comparative theology. You could do this with Quranic theology and so on and so on. So this is our understanding of Islamic comparative theology. And this also explains what we mean by Islamic political theology. So political theology was generally, or more broadly, conceptualized by Christian theologians, mainly by Christian theologians. And when we now speak about Islamic political theology, this does not only mean that we as Muslims are also engaging with political theology, but we are doing this with reference to our own normative traditions and their understanding of political concepts. So this is this normative approach we have. For example, Asma, you presented us the position of Ali Abdul Razik. What he's doing, his work is mainly work of Islamic political theology from our perspective. So, and this is also what I understand in this sense, what I will present to you today as Islamic political theology. So this only as a brief explanation of the terms we are using. So now to my presentation. So when we invited you all to this conference, we also already formulated some questions for you, which you could, if you want, answer in your panels. So one question for this panel was, how might revisionist approaches to traditional hadith, tafsir, seerah allow for transformations in Islamic political theology? So basically what I will try to do is to explain how this is possible from my perspective. So I am a proponent of historical critical exegesis, and I believe that we should claim also as Muslims this methodology. And I understand mainly also my work also as historical critical tafsir because of that, because I claim this methodology from a perspective as a Muslim. And what I have perceived in my work is that if you engage with the Quran from a historical critical tafsir perspective, one aspect which has been broadly neglected in the scholarship by Muslim and non-Muslims with regard to the Quran is the fact that the Quran itself is profiling and proposing a political theology. And this becomes very much clear if you compare the Quranic conceptions of political theology with the political theology of its context, of its time, namely of the political theology of late antiquity. I mean, it's very astonishing that we have a surah in the Quran, Surah Ar-Rum, who basically is directly recalling this major political conflict between the Byzantines, and the Sasanians, and politically, theologically speaking about these events. It's astonishing that we have Meccan surahs, several Meccan surahs, who are explicitly speaking about prophet kings in the Quran, and their political engagement, how a good prophet king should be. And still these surahs, these verses have not been profiled against this historical background. And basically what will I present today is a glimpse of my work on this aspect. So my talk is structured in three parts. I will firstly briefly speak about the relationship between monotheism and violence, and I will here present the thoughts of the cultural historian Jan Assmann. Then I will talk about Khalifa as a political theological concept. So you said Khalifa in the Quran is apolitical, so I would argue it's a political theological concept. And then in the last part I will speak about the implications of this political theological concept of Khalifa for the question of violence, the God-human relationship, and for political action. So yeah. So let me start with Jan Assmann. Most of us know him for his theory of cultural memory, but he has also a paper which is about the relationship between monotheism and violence. And I will quote, or give some quotes of him. He argues, monotheism is a religion in whose canonical text the themes of violence, hatred, and sin play a conspicuously large role and take on a different, namely specifically religious meaning than in the traditional pagan religions. There, violence exists in connection with the political principle of domination, but not in connection with the question of God. Violence is inherently a question of power, not of truth. And he makes, and this is also important, he makes a difference between exclusive and inclusive monotheism. So basically the definition of exclusive monotheism according to his is exclusive monotheism always reckons with other gods, with competing claims to power and truth, which it must reject, fight and persecute as incompatible with itself. So the first part of the Shahada, La ilaha illallah, is the poor definition of exclusive monotheism, according to him. Then in his paper, Jan Assmann describes the biblical political theology, and he explains that the whole political language of the Hebrew Bible derives from the historical context, from Assyrian royal law, which demands absolute loyalty from the vassal. And this understanding of despotism was transpositioned, he argues, to God within biblical monotheism as a new form of an exclusive relationship with God. And this was also, he argues, an act of liberation that made Israel inwardly independent of external despots. And he also argues that this understanding of exclusive monotheism leads to inwards violence, because as someone who believes in exclusive monotheism, you all have to make a choice. When your friends and your family, the society in where you live, don't follow exclusive monotheism, especially at that time, then this lead to conflicts, inward violence, he argues. So, and this is the next aspect of his theory, and I'm quoting him: as far as our question about the roots of the language of violence in the biblical text is concerned, the motive of the jealous God seems to me to be decisive. On the human side, it corresponds to the idea of being zealous for God, and thus one of the central motives of violence. Both divine and human jealousy are expressed with the same Hebrew root, kinah. In this respect, the image of God and the image of man correspond: divine jealousy and human envy. And he also argues then the language of violence is connected with jealousy and fidelity, with the fear of seduction and the terrible threats of punishment that stand for apostasy, unfaithfulness, and adultery. And he also says that the concept of martyrdom is only possible in the context of exclusive monotheism. I will not quote him. So this is also a third phenomenon, so I can sum up. So he says that the root of violence in exclusive monotheistic religions are political, theological foundations. So God, as a despotic sovereign, demands loyalty, and his devoted followers dedicate themselves entirely to his cause. Yeah. And he also says that this is related also to the concept. So only within exclusive monotheism you can have a concept such as martyrdom, and you can have a concept such as conversion. This is not possible in pagan religions to convert. And ultimately this leads to an internal inwards and an external violence. Internally, conflicts with family, society, and so on. Externally, with other religions, the destruction of other cults, and so on. So, yeah, this will I jump out. So my question is, does the Quran share the political, theological foundations claimed by Assmann? Because of course the Quranic monotheism is exclusive. Does this mean when the Quran speaks of jihad, this is analogously to be understood as being zealous for God? And he explicitly says, kinah seems to be very similar to jihad, he claims. And in the Quran we have also this problem of inward violence, inward conflicts. Because God messengers, as Ibrahim in the Quran, and so on, they have to cut the ties to their society, to their family, to their fathers, because of their monotheistic orientation. And you could argue the conflict with the Meccans is also a conflict over a sanctuary. And you can ultimately then argue, was political violence necessary to liberate monotheism on the Arabian Peninsula? So what I will now do is, in the second part, is to present a historical critical exegesis of the term Khalifa in the Quran. I believe this is a decisively political theological concept. And then I will explain or try to sum up the implications which is had for the question of violence, God-human relationship, and political action. And I will not, so the main two references in the Quran with regard to Khalifa is Surah Al-Baqarah, with Adam called Khalifa, so God decides to make him Khalifa, and the first reaction of the angels is, what are you doing? They will be mufsidun, they will be violent. So this is the first reaction of the angels. And the second person who is called Khalifa explicitly in the Quran is David in Surah As-Sad. Now, you can historically, critically, and this is very important, contextualize this conception of Khalifa with the concept, with political, theological concept in late antiquity, such as vicarious kingship, for example, in Christian tradition. You should do this. You should also contextualize this whole view of Quranic history and being Khalifa and all these derivatives of the root, istakhlafa, ja'ala Khalifa, and so on, within the political theology of the Eastern Roman Empire, but also contextualizes with the political theology of the South Arabian rulers, because this is what the Arabians knew. They knew political rulers from Saudi Arabia. We have inscriptions there. We have there the term Khalifa in these inscriptions. So please compare this and profile Quranic theology, political theology within these historical sources. This is what you usually do in other disciplines. So why not for the Quran? I will not bore you with the philological process, but what I will do now is to sum up to which results this historical critical contextualization of the term Khalifa leads to in the Quran. So, but you can ask questions, I can explain. So when the Quran calls Adam and humans as Khalifa, Khulawa, then this does not mean, and this is the what the aim is, that humans were created in the image of God. This is what the Quran is decisively giving us a counter discourse to this concept of imago Dei, because this is the exact place in the Bible where humans are created in the image of God, and in this moment the Quran is not speaking of humans as image of God, but as Khalifa. So this is done intentionally. But it's also clear that humans and Adam and humans are not Khalifa, or are Khalifa does not mean that they are God's sovereign on earth by proxy. This does also not mean that there is an imperial claim to rule by humans over creation, derivative from this fact. This also does not mean that there is a political kingdom of the righteous chosen by God. So Khalifa is not istakhlafa, and being Khalifa does not mean that you are chosen in the sense of tafdeel in the Quran. This is not fadl in the Quran. And this does also not mean that there is a messianic redeemer figure of a Khalifa in the end times, which we are awaiting when we compare this to the political, theological context in the context of the Quran. But of course you can ask me, what does it mean then, being Khalifa in the Quran? So basically, being Khalifa in the Quran means, it characterizes humans as political social beings. That what Aristotle calls zoon politikon, and with all the theological implications from the perspective of the Quran, that humans are, it is possible for humans as political social beings to fail morally. Yeah, this is the first reaction of the angels. You are creating someone who will make ifsad, who will fail, who will kill, who will make social disorder. And still, God decides to create humans because this is the creation of humans as political social beings. So anyone in the Quran, even a believer, can fail in his political responsibility. Yeah. And in the Quran we have this antagonism between being a good Khalifa, being essentially Muslim, and failing as Khalifa, as a political social being, And this makes you in the Quran as someone who is mufsid. So I give you some examples. Although Pharaoh is not called explicitly Khalifa in the Quran, he is a Khalifa, he is in political power. He is one of the sons of Adam, he is Bani Adam, and he has political responsibility. And in the Quran, he is described as someone who fails in this responsibility. He becomes a mufsid. The same is true, for example, for the Queen of Sheba in the Quran. She is at the start a non-believing woman king who has political responsibility. And the very interesting aspect of her is that she, as a woman, non-believing ruler, is criticizing in Surah An-Naml man kings who are doing ifsad, who are going to other countries and are destroying other territories and are the reason for disorder. And this is also very important. So in the Quran, you can be a non-believing, basically a God non-believing Khalifa. Yeah. So I have to respect the time. So what implications does this political theological concept of Khalifa has for the question of violence, the God-human relationship, and for political action? So I argue that any idea of a political messianic redeemer figure is inconceivable from a Quranic theological perspective. So a Khalifa cannot and should not be a prophesied redeemer figure at all. And this is important also for our present time, but also for our tradition, where we have hadiths which are talking about the Mahdi and so on, but also in our modern times where we have political groups who are waiting for, or who are conceptualizing Khalifa as a kind of redeemer figure. A second important aspect is that humans were not created explicitly in the Quran as the image of God. This is the biblical concept. So, and they cannot and should not essentially have a claim to rule over this divine creation as God does, because this is the biblical tradition of understanding what it means that humans are created in the image of God. This is one interpretation, that they are entitled to rule on earth as a God. But this is not the Quranic understanding of this. So the Quranic understanding is humans as Khalifa are moral beings. They are responsible for creation and the environment. This also means that any theocratic legitimation of political rule is excluded in the Quran. And also that any exercise of destructive and imperial violence causes essentially the failure of man as a Khalifa, or you could say as a political social being in the Quran. So you see that essentially I would argue what I'm presenting here as the result of my historical critical exegesis is this is very compatible with others like Farid Asak has argued for the term Khalifa, or in the result what Ali Abdul Razak is saying. It's very compatible. But what I do is I decisively argue from Quranic theology as a starting point and with the methodology of historical critical exegesis. And I think also what's important is that by this we can also engage as Muslims with non-Muslims who won't accept the authority of the Quran because it's the word of God, but who can accept the historical arguments I present why the political theology of the Quran would be or could be in conflict with modern Muslim conceptions of political theology. Yeah. And the last question before I stop, I also asked at the beginning, was political violence necessary to liberate monotheism on the Arabian Peninsula? Because this is what Jan Assmann argues for biblical monotheism. I would say also, yes, this is also true for the beginnings of Islam, but I would say, but this does not mean that the Quranic God is a jealous God and demands politically absolute loyalty, and that the devoted followers dedicate themselves entirely to the cause of establishing God's rule. This is the case in the biblical Hebrew, historically, critically, but this is not, as I have argued, the case for the Quran. And this has huge implications for any modern Muslim, Islamic, political theology.